Alrighty, I guess we're here. Hey, everybody, welcome to the Combo Couch. I am Fiorella Isabel, and I have with me three amazing guests. I wanted to have this conversation because I've been having arguments with other people about this very topic regarding China, regarding Russia, regarding multipolarity, regarding what's really going on behind the scenes of what we're seeing, this shift and the fall of the West. Of course, in line with that is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We have the tensions rising between China and the United States. These are things we talk about on the show all the time. But behind that, of course, is the talk about the Great Reset and what that means in terms of the surveillance state, what that means in terms of the nation states. Is that really happening? Is the resistance real? Are we really going into a world of multipolarity, or is this just all a facade? So, with me today, I have the three wonderful guests. Um, we have Danny Haiphong from Black Agenda Report, who also has his own YouTube channel. And we also have with us Ryan Cristian from The Last American Vagabond, who has been censored by Twitter, YouTube, you name it, and who does great analysis as well. And then we have Matthew Ehret, the Canadian patriot, has his own Substack, historian, has done several discussions or roundtables or such about this very topic as well. And I wanted to bring in three different perspectives because I pay attention to all three of you. I follow all of you on social media, so I kind of get a gist as to where you are on this. And so I really just wanted to dive deep into these conversations. So thank you for being here.
It's great to be on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Okay, great. So let's just get started because I have a lot of questions. So on what's been going on with the U.S. provocations in Taiwan, right? I want to get into the bottom of what are the reasons for the visits? Is this militarily a pushback from the West into fluffing their feathers against China? Is it deeper? We're going to talk about the economics of it, right? So Nancy Pelosi went to Taipei against China's wishes. Most recently, Senator Markey also took a delegation as well, even though China was largely against Pelosi's visit. And then there were some economic retaliations along the way. Let's also remember that on paper, the US recognizes the one China policy. And let's also mention that Taiwan is the largest semiconductor producer. And so I wanted to first off get to this question, which when this happened with Pelosi and China didn't respond militarily, a lot of people in the West were claiming, hey, that is showing China's weakness. China is showing that they're not going to go through with their word. Although, let's be fair, China never said they were going to take down Pelosi's plane. They said they might escort the plane. It wasn't anything that was really indicated other than people's desires for Pelosi's plane to not make it, right? So was China weak? And if not, were they attacking this in a different, more methodical economic way? And I'll start, of course, let me just start with Ryan.
Well, first, Tap, thanks for having us all on. I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation. I think ultimately we can look at that situation and see that the entire conversation about her plane being shot down or military action was this, bluster, the corporate media creation, in my opinion. Now, it's not that that's not possible, obviously, but I think that was the corporate media pushing that and the arguments from the partisanship showing their face. And I think ultimately, I never thought that was in the cards. I think that was an obvious reality that would have been a gigantic overstep. I mean, there's a lot of things that we could have talked about in that regard, but my opinion to kind of start off from the beginning of all of it is that this was more of a, I hate to even talk about how things that could be distractions from other topics because that's a common argument, but I do believe that this was more of a look over there kind of a thing, even though there's always been this ongoing issue there that is very important. But I also think that her going there and the issue was meant to create this conversation again and take your focus away from other things, but ultimately to maybe, in my opinion, create the illusion that there's more divide than there really is. Because I have the stance more so that from a core level, there's much more coordination happening behind the scenes than we like to talk about. Now, that does not mean there's not adversarial situations happening in a lot of different political ways. But I think the crux of the point of this discussion today is I believe that it's more about larger agendas playing out. And I think that was more of a misdirection tactic personally, but there's a lot to be said. I'm sure we're going to get into about Taiwan and the right to declare independence, or whether that's even what's happening, and whether, and so on. But just to kind of start off the overview, that's what I think.
Okay, awesome. And Matthew, I want to hear from you as well.
Yes, absolutely. Well, from my standpoint, I do think that there is an element of distraction in there, and Putin did come out and he said something to that effect not that long ago, to deflect from the actual collapse of the banking system, the entire social structure within the United States itself, and I would say the broader transatlantic. There's an element of that, but I would think that looking at the last decade of Taiwan, especially starting in 8 years. I see a lot of parallels. I think a lot of people do to the game plan that was deployed in Ukraine. And 2014 wasn't just the year where you had an NED, U.S. State Department organized regime change in Ukraine, but you also had a sunflower revolution as well in Taiwan, 2014, which saw the installation effectively of the current configuration of power of puppets in that regime. And just like in the case of Ukraine, there was, they were very close to consolidating a new trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union that would have integrated Ukraine ever more into the Eurasian Economic Union orientation, which is much more focused on industrial growth, not so much speculation or just cash cropping, which is how some people wanted to see Ukraine. Same thing for Taiwan. The Kuomintang were very close to finalizing a very important free trade agreement with many aspects with mainland China. Already their trade is, I think it's 50% of their trade goes to mainland and also Hong Kong. So it's, I think that what we have had now is an effort to try to, just like we see the full spectrum dominance and encirclement of Russia with an ideology of getting a capability of launching a first strike without having a retaliation by Russia, by those controlling the whole full spectrum dominance, program in the West. You see the same thing with 100,000 U.S. troops built up around China's perimeter. And, THAAD missile shields in South Korea. And basically, I think right now, there's a position of weakness that the U.S. is coming at the situation. Their entire system, as we pointed out, is collapsing. And I think that China has time on their side. They're not necessarily, it's not a sign of their weakness that they didn't choose to go in aggressively. I think that they are aware that it's a matter of being able to wait and allow the self-cannibalizing technocrats to eat themselves up. I think so. There's a lot of patience, and so they let Pelosi do her thing. But overall, last word, I think they just want to throw in everything at China right now possible that they have as assets within the Pacific, and the kitchen sink. And the kitchen sink happens to be any Asian country that is that can be used to light a flame around China's perimeter and justify a U.S. military buildup. That's how I'm seeing it.
And Danny, do you see this? Ryan mentioned something about there's been a lot of talk behind the scenes. Do you think there's been a lot of talk behind the scenes, or do you think that China just methodically chose to act in a more economic, retaliatory way instead of a militaristic way?
Well, there's always channels, and surely there's always back channels. But I find what's interesting about China's response is that I think there's been a lot of downplaying how China actually did put into place a series of measures after Pelosi's visit that are pretty significant. And this included actually stopping very key defense coordination talks that had been happening. And many people don't know about them because, again, these are channels that aren't necessarily public. So I think there were about three back channels, three defense coordination measures that were completely canceled. So China took this very seriously, and they conducted live fire drills surrounding Taiwan, and I believe 5 or 6 different places, basically showing that if the United States wants to play with fire, that it will actually get burned, because there is absolutely no way that the United States can use Taiwan in the way that I think a large section of the foreign policy establishment wants to use Taiwan, as what it was prior to the One China policy, which was a de facto U.S. military base with tens of thousands of U.S. troops with nuclear weapons possibly pointing right at China. That's how the Cold War played out. After the One China policy, those troops went home, but the United States passed the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979, which basically said that the One China policy didn't stop it from sending tens of billions of dollars in weapons to Taiwan. And that has escalated since this pivot to Asia, which was formerly put into place in 2012, but talked about since 2009, where Obama, then Trump, now Biden continue to increase what is now, I think, like a 14, 15, probably will be a lot more than that very soon, $1 billion backlog in weapons transfers to Taiwan, and as well as sending military personnel. I think there's about 20 plus military personnel there stationed in Taiwan, which is double, which went up 2 times between 2020 and 2021. So this has a military component, of course, all of this when it comes to Taiwan. As Matt was saying, this is a larger plan to militarily encircle China. Taiwan is just a chip into that, not to be ironic with the reference to chips. It is actually maybe the biggest chip in terms of how the United States wants to create a situation which we could compare to Ukraine, but I think that the stakes are actually higher, because unlike Ukraine, which, people can have their arguments about how, the Soviet Union fell and Ukraine, became a sovereign country. The fact of the matter is that under international law, as it stands right now, Taiwan is part of China and Ukraine is not. So there is, and Ukraine is not part of Russia. So there is a big difference here that I think actually raises the stakes militarily. In terms of economics, of course, this is going on. The U.S. passed the CHIPS Act. They're trying to play what I think is a pretty suicidal game, pressuring Taiwan to use its massive semiconductor industry, which is basically almost all of the world's total, and maneuver in a way. Pelosi's son was there. He's a big tech magnate. Like there are these maneuvers trying to be done to try to isolate China from the semiconductor industry. That's the end game. The United States thinks it's going to build these semiconductors. I think nothing of the sort will actually happen. But the point is that all of this could actually backfire big time on Taiwan. And Matt is correct. There is only time that China has to kind of wait this out, because the economic and military measures the U.S. is taking don't bode well for itself. Like, continue to provoke this. There's no advantage that the United States has right now militarily. Economically, Taiwan could be in big trouble if the U.S. continues to pursue its policy of trying to isolate China, which Taiwan is a huge, its local economy is a huge partner with China, while at the same time doing something that U.S. investors, the financiers, investors, they're not going to do. They're not going to pour money into building what's needed to have a semiconductor industry here. They're going to take that money and they're going to do what they always do with it, which is cash in. And so it's really a suicidal course. And I think China's measures were actually pretty strong. And I think with the understanding that this was actually going to continue, that this is not some kind of one-off. And of course, Ed Markey proved that. And I think that this is also a big political move, in the sense that the Democrats are really desperate right now. There's just no doubt about that. Everything the Democratic Party is doing right now is really all about showing that it has legitimacy coming up in this midterm election, from the Inflation Reduction Act to all these moves around China. All of it is to try to make the Democratic Party look strong, right? Militaristic towards China, tough on China, and also look at how much the Democrats are addressing the economy. That's kind of what also is going on here as well. And that's why Nancy Pelosi can't really, she can barely talk as it is, but she can't really talk about it in any kind of clear way, because she doesn't, I don't think she has a grasp of all of the interests at heart, but the main one for her is to try to keep her in a position that she's in. She does not want to be ousted as the majority leader in November, even though that's pretty likely going to be the case.
Fee, if I could elaborate, if I could clarify one point, just I wanted to make sure it's clear that the discussion of them talking behind the scenes, that definitely is there too. But what I was more saying is just more general collaboration, not even necessarily only around Taiwan, just to make that clear. And I think that adds to add to this whole thing, is that I think both of these things are kind of simultaneous, or at the very least, we should be asking how prevalent a very real divide that is happening in this country of like this kind of technocratic direction versus these old school neocon kind of mentality that is playing at the same time, where I think there's part of this, like ask whether there are vying interests within the United States in the same idea and playing that game on the world stage and with foreign policy. Whereas that might be what's happening with Taiwan, whereas there is collaboration from like a technocratic great reset direction with these governments or parts of them. But there's also parts of them that want to push this issue with Taiwan. And it very clearly has overlaps we'll probably get into with, like, for instance, the Donbass region in Ukraine and how that plays and looking at one and ignoring the other and so on. But I just want to clarify that. So before we go forward.
Yeah, so just going forward then on that route, right? Multipolarity. A lot of talk has been happening around multipolarity, that, you know, the West is falling apart. They're doing this to themselves. In some ways, people have said this is the controlled demolition of the West, meaning the United States and the EU are sanctioning Russia and are doing this to their own detriment, right? People in the EU right now are looking for ways to perhaps warm themselves in the winter by finding firewood. They're being told that they should take cold showers. They're being told they should leave the country in the winter. I mean, these are the things that are happening right now because of this conflict. Now, Russia's being blamed, and we're going to bring in Russia into this because it seems like the United States is trying to fight a two-front war. And we all know that the United States cannot win a two-front war right now. I mean, they're not winning right now in against Russia via Ukraine, and they cannot beat China either. So that is something that is happening, but that's what it seems like they're trying to do. Now, this resistance that's come from China and from Russia has been seen to many as this age of ushering in a multipolar world, going from the unilateral world where the United States called all the shots, where the United States basically dictated something and everybody else had to follow along, to a world where there is more of a discussion, more of an equitable world where you have nations within Africa pushing back against the West. Most recently, South Africa saying that the West always seems to want to boss them around, that they have more reliance in BRICS countries. And then you also have, of course, Latin America. What's happening in Latin America with the pink tide? What's going on with them focusing on gaining sovereignty against this, century-old, at this point, just control by the United States and the West. So we're seeing that pushback. The question is this pushback towards multipolarity a real thing, or is it just a giant facade? And I wanted to start this discussion because I think a lot of you will have a lot to say about this by playing this video of Vladimir Putin. He talked about this. He talked about this. A group of he called them global elites, and saying that the United States wants to distract the population away from the problems they have at home by focusing on Russia and China. So, Sleepy, if we can just play it and then we'll discuss.
I did not get sent that video.
Oh, okay. So it's
If
on
you
the
send me a link, I can get it up.
Yeah. Where would you like the link?
Throw it in the private chat.
Private chat of what?
StreamYard.
Oh, StreamYard. Okay, 1 second. And if anybody has anything to say while I do that, you're welcome to start on the discussion. Let me see.
Well, I guess, since there's time to talk, I think that it's interesting that we can see both of these things happening simultaneously, right? I mean, I think there's an effort to make that happen, right? And I don't even know why anybody would oppose the idea where people have their own voice as opposed to one group leading it all. But I think that that's more of, again, that kind of vying agenda at the end of the day. And I think we can kind of see that from a core value or core level, all of these governments are at least inching toward the direction of what the World Economic Forum is pushing, which is by no means multipolar in any way, in my opinion, but I'm sure we can discuss that.
Okay. Sleepy, do you have it?
I'm just about done. I got it up in a second.
Okay, great. So we'll be right there.
Ситуация на Украине показывает, что США пытаются затянуть этот конфликт. И точно так же они действуют, разжигая конфликтный потенциал в Азии, Африке, Латинской Америке. Как известно, недавно США в очередной раз сознательно попытались подлить масло в огонь и раскачать ситуацию в Азиатско-Тихоокеанском регионе. Американская авантюра в отношении Тайваня – это не просто поездка отдельного безответственного политика, а часть целенаправленной, сознательной стратегии США по дестабилизации и хаотизации обстановки в регионе и мире. Наглая демонстрация неуважения к суверенитету других стран и к своим международным обязательствам. Видим в этом тщательно спланированную провокацию. Очевидно, что с помощью подобных действий западные глобалистские элиты, в том числе, пытаются отвлечь внимание своих собственных граждан от острых социально-экономических проблем. Падения уровня жизни, безработицы, бедности, деиндустриализации. Переложить собственные провалы на другие страны, на Россию, на Китай, которые отстаивают свою точку зрения. Строят суверенную политику развития, не подчиняясь диктату наднациональных элит.
All right. So, Danny, do you see this pushback from Russia and China and what Putin just said as nations standing up for their own sovereign right, or do you see it as something more?
Well, I think there are many different things at play when it comes to multipolarity. I do think that the thrust of multipolarity is definitely sovereignty. I mean, it really comes out of the post-Soviet era where the United States was able to essentially impose this full spectrum dominance that Matt was talking about earlier, and essentially declare the end of history, or there is no alternative, right? These philosophies that said the United States' economic and political model, its neoliberal imperialist model, is the only one that's going to exist. Now, of course, the United States forgot about China because they believed that their cooperation with China would lead to China falling into a situation where it would have to turn itself into a so-called Western-style parliamentary democracy. It didn't happen like that. And of course, we know what has transpired since then, where the United States has overstretched itself militarily. Its economy, its capitalist economy, is contracting or stagnating at any given moment. And now we know how fragile of a situation it is as the so-called superpower now leading Europe into the abyss through its proxy war with Russia. So in a sense, multipolarity is in part about US decline, hegemonic decline, its imperial decline. But it also is about sovereignty of those nations that were deemed to be kind of left for dead. That China was not supposed to be able to surpass the United States in any kind of realm, economically, in terms of its political influence, anything like that. Russia was never supposed to recover from the damage of the fall of the Soviet Union, the shock therapy, all that transpired there. It was supposed to remain a weak state. Paul Wolfowitz had a whole doctrine about how Russia would need to continue to be broken up and broken up and broken up because it needed to remain weak. It was not expected to do what's happened since 2007, which is to kind of reverse a lot of this damage and go on a sovereign path and build an alliance with China that is very robust, strong, and getting stronger by the year. So yes, it is about sovereignty, and it's also about how the world is going to be governed, right? And I think that this is important because in the 20th century, imperialism was dividing the world, and there were a lot of anti-colonial movements, socialist movements that fought against that, right? And now in the so-called superpower era, full spectrum dominance era of the United States, everything that the US did with its so-called junior partners is all about how to govern the world. How is the world going to be governed? How are countries going to be kept in a unipolar model? How is the international financial system going to plunder them, steal from them, loot them, and keep this 1%, this capitalist class, continuing on in super profits? Now the situation is different because, and a lot of this is because of China, but Russia is also there too. You have two of the biggest countries in the world, with China with one of the biggest economies. Russia has the potential to be one of the biggest economies in the world. You have two really mega powers now charting a different path along with countries that had already been doing so. They had just been smaller, right? So you talked about the pink tie, the leftist governments in Latin America. They just have smaller economies. They're a lot poorer, but in a sense, they are also charting their own vision of integration through institutions like ALBA. And we see how desperate the United States is in Africa and in Eurasia to prevent any kind of integration like what's happening in Latin America, or to prevent China's Belt and Road Initiative or Russia's Eurasian Economic Union, to prevent all of these integration projects from actually bearing fruit. It's not really working, but at the same time, the United States does have a significant section of its foreign policy establishment that is willing, as you said, a two-front war, is willing to test the waters. And I think Ukraine, I think Taiwan, I think these are issues in part that are about testing the waters to prevent this trend from continuing and turning into what I don't think we know exactly how it will look, but we know what the visions are for each respective bloc.
So, Matt, are we actually seeing this resistance from the West? Is this resistance real? Like Danny just mentioned, a resistance to a global predator class, or is this just merely a step, as Ryan just mentioned, towards the Great Reset? Is there so much, a lot of cooperation behind the scenes to usher us into this technocratic surveillance state? What is your opinion on that, on those different interpretations?
Sure. Yeah. Just so I could pace myself. How long are we going for today? And
So a little, probably an hour 15.
All right. Just for an overall idea. Yeah, no, just I guess to be as quick as I can, I do think that the resistance is genuine, although I don't think that it's untainted. Like the way I tend to look at my analysis of history and geopolitics is not by presuming the existence of nation states that have any crystallized form in the world today. I don't think there are any. I think all of history has been shaped by oligarchical systems that are supranational, and that have and wield fifth columns in every country. I don't think there's a country devoid of remnants, or not traces, or are either dominated completely or almost completely by fifth column style operations, which have no allegiance to any one nation. So people say the US empire. I don't really buy it. I think there's something that came in and took control over John F. Kennedy's dead body and his brother. I think, when I look at Russia, when I look at China, a big chunk of, I see it as a battle. I think that they've done a much better job at de-weeding their garden than we have, whereas the weeds have really taken over in the West, which used to have a greater degree of sovereignty. And again, when I'm saying this, I'm saying before we were born. I mean, I'm talking like Charles de Gaulle period here. You got to go back in time, where there was like some serious anti-Malthusian resistance. But when, I guess I could say I try to get into the mind of an oligarch. So knowing that human history has been shaped by oligarchical systems that have always wanted the same thing, which is ultimate total power, total mastery over a dumbed down talking cow slave society. There's the idea of keeping society in a feudal state of loving their shackles, their simple life as little hobbits under a feudal serfdom where there's low education, low quality thinking, not a lot of ability to produce for yourself or determine your own sovereign destiny as a people. That's always been there, where the inbred upper echelon elites are like partying and orgies in their castles. That's something which I think it's kind of a miracle that we ever broke out of that to begin with. I don't think that the oligarchy just let us have literacy to orphans and have technological advance. I think that was a fight, as was every single advance towards the emancipation of the species. So today, when I look at the core values of the multipolar versus unipolar, Ryan alluded to the idea that there are common core principles. Or common core values. I think I heard, and I don't really see that, considering that I think among the top, we are going to have a new system. Like the system that we currently have been living under for the past 40, 50, 60 years is over. Like that's done. It's a bubble, and it's built to be a time bomb of speculative debt, of derivatives built upon unpayable debts that are going to deleverage, that are being, and they're doubling down on the triggering of the blowout. But in the same measure, what's that new system going to look like? And I think that the cybernetic sort of Malthusian priesthood that has embedded itself, because I mean, these fifth columns have to coordinate. And I think one of the cultish coordinating ideologies is cybernetics, or this idea of systems analysis, which has embedded itself within a lot of the deep states of the world. There's a certain common view that humanity has to reduce its population to what computer models deem to be, sustainable within carrying capacity of nature's supposed, mathematical equilibrium. And I think the consensus is something like 1 billion souls are allowed to be, exist. The useless eaters otherwise have to be disappeared, whether Soylent Green or some other, terrible thing. I don't know. Part of that also is destroying from nation states the ability to have the powers of productivity and the type of energy that would give them the means to support their population, as well as dumbing down people. Those who are permitted to survive have to be highly reduced in mental power. So when I look at the activity, the effects of the policies of the Belt and Road Initiative, of the type of commitments, you can map out the Belt and Road projects around the world. There's $4 trillion worth, and it's a wide set of projects in Africa, in Asia, all over in Latin America. They have the effect of enhancing the stupidification and dumbing down and depopulation of the people of the world? Does it cripple the nation's abilities to have economic sovereignty, or does it enhance those things? And I see the effect as being opposite to those depopulation fanatics, because it seems to be doing the opposite. It's increasing the quality of life, the powers of productivity per capita, the industrial power of nations, which has always been prevented from growing by the colonial class. Whether it was in Africa or anywhere, they would never allow for nations in Africa to have engineering skills or full spectrum industrial economies. No, it would be either cash cropping, go there, loot their resources, ship it out. That's it, and keep them fighting. I don't see that. Whether in Southwest Asia and the Middle East as well, there's a lot of projects to provide healing and rebuilding, real reconstruction, which is, I think, why these civilizational forces, which is really, they're more than nation states, Russia, China, India, Iran. I think they see themselves as more than that, and they don't really want to sacrifice their 5,000, 6,000, 7,000-year-old civilizations under this depopulation, mass culling. I don't think that the current leadership wants to do that, even though there are fifth columnists in those countries still today that haven't been extracted, that were built up under the days of perestroika. Or in the case of China, George Soros had his man in China as the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Zhao Ziyang, for 2 years, up until 1989, when Soros was kicked out of China. Zhao Ziyang, they co-ran a think tank together. He brought in Alvin Toffler, all of the futurists, the third wave, the fourth industrial revolution. All of these things were being brought in the 80s in China. So it's like, why didn't they keep their control? Why didn't Soros keep his guy in there? Why didn't Yeltsin, who was another Western stooge, why didn't he just stay in power? Why didn't they continue those policies of the Great New World Order 90s? I see a lot of evidence that there is a resistance of nationalists who don't want to, and real patriots of their civilizations who don't want to, again, commit suicide.
Ryan, I just want to ask you if you can respond to that, because where is the evidence that you see to counteract that? He said he's seen evidence that, no, this doesn't make sense. Why didn't this happen before? And then we can talk about history, right? And the resistance. And if that were the case, then there would have never been the fights that we've won throughout history. Humanity, there's always been humans fighting against this, whatever force, the global elite, the predator class, whatever you want to call them. Why do you see otherwise? What evidence, specifically regarding China and Russia, you can include, that you see that there is a lot of just combined, at least from behind the scenes, right? Communication and talks in the general sense.
Well, I don't see them as mutually exclusive, right? I mean, I think they're simultaneous. Like, I think there's a lot of, that's what he's kind of talking about, is there's different parts to this. There are definitely people that are fighting for that, you could argue, and, I think prove in a lot of different ways throughout history and today. But I definitely do see that there's a lot of evidence. James Corbett, I always reference on this, does great work kind of showing these lines, usually facilitated through Israel, of even transferring technology, like to China, and things that don't really add up with the general narrative. But ultimately, I think what's important to think about, to take your point, Matt, is, going back to something like like times of monarchies, kings and things like that. How did that ever change? I mean, realistically, I think the question we should ask is, did it actually change? Or were we just transitioned into a new perception of the same thing? And I argue that's exactly what's happening today. We're just simply being guided and shuffled into this new thing as if it's going to change everything, more equitable, sustainable. And really, it's just another way to recapture the people into a new technocratic panopticon. And that's kind of what I see building. So I think what we're seeing today is both of these simultaneously, like I was saying before, is it ultimately, I think, here's my take on why I think that both happen. Ultimately, I think let's just take Russia and China specifically. I think any government, and call me a pessimist, I think all governments are problematic today, but I think China and Russia or any government will look at what the technocrats, what the Great Reset is proposing, and they're just salivating at the idea of having such complete top-down control over literally everything people do in their country and using that, selling that, capitalizing on that more so than today. But that may come to heads with maybe their perception on their sovereignty, right? Because it's not being blatantly sold as like, we're going to take your sovereignty away. They're still arguing that it's more about having more collaboration, public-private partnerships. And so at the end of the day, they could try to sell it as something else, but really anybody honest can look at it and say, clearly that's about a new world order, the globalist government, the new kind of one government idea for the world. And I think China and Russia specifically are kind of like, well, we'll go along with this to the extent to we can get that kind of control, but we will still try to maintain our sovereignty. That's just my opinion. I don't know how we could possibly know that, but I think that's what we're seeing play out. They're trying to kind of capitalize on that because we can see them involved with the Great Reset in general, things like Event 201, if you see them as connected as I do, this kind of long sought, coordination. But at the same time, I do believe there's a lot of things, a lot of adversarial action happening in Ukraine, happening with Taiwan and China. And I go back to the point that I think those are different vying agendas at the core point of this. But overall, I think the globalist push, whether the United States or anywhere else, is by far the biggest and most, it involves the most people in these governments than anything else. That'd be my ultimate opinion. But to speak to the idea of how they're, right now they're like, let's take Ukraine, for example, trying to blame everything that they're creating on like Russia's actions in Ukraine. That's an easy thing to do. Just dump it on them. Putin did it all. Putin's gas hike. When in reality, they're systematically breaking these systems down everywhere, multiple countries simultaneously. I don't know how you can see that as anything else other than a rapid coordination of multiple governments to drive in an agenda. I believe that's the Great Reset. You can come to your own conclusions, but that can't exist without that kind of coordination, like we're seeing a lockstep rollout of an agenda around any pandemic. There's obvious coordination, but I think there's a lot of people within these governments that just don't necessarily want that, or at least don't want all of it. But that's for everyone to decide for themselves.
Regarding China, right? I want to kind of focus on China because China has lifted millions of people out of poverty, has provided healthcare, has provided some of the most advanced public transportation, and as we've mentioned, a sense of pride, of pride in their nation. We hear little complaints coming from the Chinese themselves. We hear complaints from the neocon population in the United States. We also hear complaints from other people that are saying, "Wait a minute, there are some problems." So China has been criticized for its close watch on media, social media surveillance, its social credit system, the most strict COVID policies, including lockdowns and just biometric use of just so much technology that has such power over people, such top-down control. Is this actually authoritarianism? Is this necessary, or is this something that is necessary or was necessary for China in terms of stopping Western influence? Because that's always the discussion. Is a lot of people call these socialist or communist or just resistant type of governments authoritarian, but there are many reasons that they put out to say, well, this is why we don't allow this propaganda. This is why we do what we do, because we don't want the West to come in. So are China's actions, particularly regarding what happened during COVID and their social credit system, are they justified, or are they just completely unnecessary? And I'll start with Danny on that.
Well, it's a huge question. I think for one, look, everything, and I think everyone here has been speaking on this, talking about contradictions. There's always many things are going to be happening at the same time. And I do think that with any policy, right, there is no so-called perfection. That's not the world that we live in. We live in a world that is markedly struggling with class warfare, with imperialist warfare, with just this people say oligarchy. It is a global oligarchy. It is, like, in my opinion, it's a capitalist oligarchy, and it is a very dangerous one. I believe that the United States is an empire, a particular kind of empire that followed other empires, and it has created very complicated conditions for any nation to navigate, that, or any people, any oppressed people, any movement to navigate. And so when it comes to, let's just take COVID-19, we have to take a few things into consideration. We have to take into consideration China's history. So before 1949, China was considered the quote unquote sick man of Asia. It's not just that that was a racist stereotype, because it was a yellow peril stereotype. It was also because the conditions that Western domination, that this century of humiliation that people in China call it, it was also that people actually died en masse of very preventable diseases. And so there is a lot of, in China, a very deep experience with this. And then we don't even have to reference the fact that SARS, in 2000, what was that, 2006? I think it was 2006. That outbreak gave them a lot of experience about what happens when you don't do anything, right? So how China responded to the novel coronavirus that became COVID-19 was incredibly comprehensive, and you could call it strict and quote unquote authoritarian, because it was all about protecting people's lives. And China did an incredible job of doing that, and continues on a very similar path, despite the fact that the entire world has kind of decided to go other directions. And now, one thing I will say about China's COVID-19 response, that despite whatever problems it has, one of the things that it's really trying to ensure is that older people and disabled people are protected. And there are very few ways you can do that with such a highly contagious disease. And this is how they feel is the only way to do that. And so for me, I don't feel it's my right to say that they shouldn't be doing that, that there are other ways, because I don't think that there are other ways. And so I think that's the complicated environment that China is navigating. But despite that, it has still been able to maintain some semblance of economic growth, pursue its objectives. Fee, you said, they eradicate extreme poverty, and that was during the pandemic. They still continued on that path. So I think that there's a lot of different considerations here. And of course, it's not perfect. They criticize themselves. They can't do certain things because there's a very complicated world environment, and also a complicated political environment in the country. But I also think that with other issues like surveillance, I think that one point that's never made is that a lot of China's surveillance, even if it does overstretch, right? Even some media suppression feels like it's an overstretch, but people don't understand, and I think we should understand it the best in the US especially, is that tech corporations, monopolies like Google, all of them, they come not just with their private interests, but they come with the military intelligence apparatus in the interests of those countries, especially the United States. So Google, for example, is deeply wedded to the Central Intelligence Agency and others. And China has found out through WikiLeaks, thank you, Julian Assange, that the CIA had actually been taking information from China, technological information, things around aviation, things around energy, and also private consumer data, taking that information in order to spy on China. And so a lot of the repression that comes in China around the media is a reaction, just like in the DPRK, where there's an incredible amount of repression around certain messages, etc., from the West. This reaction is based on what is deemed to be a legitimate threat to China's governance and to China's political economy, to its system, to the system that most people in China want to have. So I think that is not talked about enough, and I just want to add that to the conversation. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Ryan, I definitely want to hear your take on this in a second, but Matt, is you know what Danny mentioned, by the way, the social credit system is something that it's never talked about. It's never really just mentioned in a lot of ways when people are saying how great China is. I just don't ever hear like, okay, but what about this? We do have something like that in the United States with your credit score. You know, it's very similar, so I don't think it's an end all be all. But how does how does the idea that, you know, China is different, that there are, you know, varying factions here fighting against this real unilateral hold from the West, from this global elitist perspective, how does that stand when China followed very similar COVID protocols to the West? A lot of protocols that, you know, depending on where you fall on the side of the aisle on this, have been debunked or have been, at the very least, largely contested in the United States now as not being accurate. We're seeing the backpedaling of a lot of these things that were said about the necessity of vaccination, et cetera, in regarding COVID. So how does that sort of juxtapose and exist in the same realm then?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think that the way I look at it is I don't see the world right now, or as it has been for the past decades, as a world in peace. I think that a war has been active and ongoing continuously. You know, they say the Cold War was like, you know, that was it. The U.S. won. No, there was an ongoing war. It just took on different forms, hybrid wars and other things, to do what Zbigniew Brzezinski, you know, wrote about and demonstrated in his grand chessboard, to balkanize not just the former Soviet states, but really all of Russia into something like, what is it, 9 different micro federations under the control of the IMF. That was always, you know, a very high trophy. Same thing for China. You can see a lot of the Western think tanks producing all sorts of, you know, documents over the last, you know, 3-4 decades, really the last 2-3 decades, showcasing a highly balkanized, you know, China, with different ethnic tribal groups becoming their own little local controllers, but all completely not coordinated, not a cohesive nation that is capable of standing on its own 2 feet and doing battle with the sort of centralized power structure that we are dealing with when you're dealing with the international financier oligarchy, with its highly centralized global command structure in terms of intelligence, the Five Eyes, City of London, the entire gamut, right? Military industrial aspect, the whole thing, but they're different aspects of the same thing. So to do battle, you do have to have, I think, a certain coherence. You can't allow yourself to be broken up from within, divided from within, if you're going to be able to carry out that type of fight. I think in that sense, China has been, I think, looking at and I'm assuming we're not streaming to like YouTube or something, so I'm going to be a bit more candid in the words I use, or am I?
We are,
we?
but we
Oh,
are,
okay.
but you
Yeah,
can
fine.
still
All right.
still say what you need to say.
I can say
So
things. All right. Well, we'll see. Okay. Well, here I think they've been looking at things like the Project for New American Centuries. You know, rebuilding America's defenses. I took out a little quote. You know, in the year October 2000. This is, you know, the whole Wolfowitz team compiled this dystopic vision for what the world would look like going forward, and this is before 9/11 even. Pointing out that combat will likely take place, this is a quote, in new dimensions, in space and cyberspace, and perhaps the world of microbes. Advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. I think we've all seen that quote before, but I think that the Chinese intelligentsia, the leadership, have been looking very closely at that, and they've been looking very closely at things like anthrax, and that whole inside job that was used to scare the crap out of a lot of people. Turns out, you know, it really was an inside job done with, you know, there was some expendable low-level guy working at Fort Detrick who was thrown under the bus. But what did that justify was the BioShield Act, you know, a $5 billion operation, bioweapon facilities, or let's call them biolaboratories, we'll call them that, in Georgia, in Ukraine, sponsored by I mean, Obama was originally an early part of that team on the ground in Georgia with a few others, and also in South Korea. You know, Obama went on afterwards to continue this policy, and he created things like the Jupiter and Centaur bioweapons facilities in South Korea, which are huge. I mean, this is a very highly controlled system that has no control by the South Korean government. And I mean, the Koreans have had protests on the streets because they're freaked out that something could be released. There's other things all over the Pacific. I mean, I think the last count was like, I was surprised at how high the number was, like 329 or so internationally, international biolabs connected to Pentagon and other activities. Like, yeah, it's a big number. A lot of it's totally opaque. So I think, China they're not controlling the narrative. They have not been, up until very recently, powerful enough, neither has Russia up until recently, to really shape the macro narratives of what shapes the great game internationally. So I think, rather than just try to say, okay, the green agenda is part of an anti-nation depopulation agenda. You're not going to just say that if you're somebody representing a whole nation. You're not going to come out. It happens that way. But what they will do is they will sabotage things like, COP21, where China and India will lock themselves in this in a room for several days at this conference that was supposed to be the thing in 2009 during the bird flu, H1N1, right? And the first wave of the near meltdown of the banking system. They'll lock themselves in and just sabotage the thing that was supposed to be the conference that would usher in binding decarbonization treaties that could be enforceable by new global government mechanisms. Why didn't that work? It's because, again, they locked themselves in. They brought Sudan, a bunch of other African countries. They didn't come out. So they sabotaged it. In a sense, they bought the world some time to try to get our shit together. We didn't get our shit together. Same thing for COP26. It was a bit of a disaster. It wasn't the thing that was being celebrated as this great global governance post-nation state, thing that was going to solidify this new global system. So I think they've been trying to have influence in the narratives that if you can't beat them, try to get in and influence them to your favor in any way possible. I think that China has been very concerned that maybe this thing that was unleashed as a pathogen, whatever it was, is not the great bad killer that mainstream media has told us it is. But I think that they're freaked out that something is in the works to be unleashed. I mean, I think that they've been trying to keep a consolidated, centralized hold on the situation before they could, before they go into a situation of balkanization. Or, and also there's a lot of there's millions of assets who are under the pay of the West. Bolton gave an interview with Bloomberg not that long ago on Chinese social credit. And he made the point that the surveillance and social credit systems have made it very difficult, if not impossible, for the CIA to maintain their assets. And he was complaining as if people would have a sympathetic heart or something to his plight. So I think that there is a war to destroy China. It's didn't go away, and I think China is in a situation where they're trying to keep as much as possible. They're trying to purge the traitors. There's been 1.5 million people, most of whom are part of the Chinese Communist Party, who have been purged from the party, put in jail for corruption charges, or have escaped completely, like former billionaire Miles Guo, who's working with Bannon and the whole Falun Gong cult as part of another psyop. So you have different aspects of this beast inside of China internationally. A lot of them were built up when the CIA color revolution failed in 1989. It worked in other places, but it failed to create the regime change where Soros's agent was put in his little Yeltsin dictator. That didn't work out. And a lot of those who were working very closely with Zhao Ziyang either went to jail or they escaped and were given safe haven in Vancouver, New York, other Five Eyes territories, and have been carrying out an operation, a war ever since. So that's how I tend to look at it. I don't agree. I think it's distasteful. I love personal liberty, and I don't like that. But I mean, it's the real politics, the real world is what it is, and I think that it could be seen as a justified policy based on what I just said as far as context.
Ryan, you were one of the people that was most ahead on the COVID narrative. I mean, you from the moment everything began, you called it out. What is your opinion on not just China's COVID policy stands, but where it seems to be headed in terms of the Great Reset?
Yeah, there's so many directions to take this in. I think at the end of the day, from a standpoint of liberty or just sovereignty, any individual rights, what's happening there is a problem in general. And we see these governments salivating about the exact same idea: the social credit system, the digital ID, the QR codes, the vaccine passports, digital ID being the very focus of all of that, really. Even the vaccinations driving you in a position. And we see this taking place in Canada today, where You can have all your vaccinations and everything proven, except you don't have the app and you can't come in, right? There's a very clear wall there. Now, I think it's problematic. First, to address the idea of, this push that we've seen, I'm not to make it a partisan. I think I've seen it one side more than the other, but the idea that authoritarianism is justified because of the United States or because of what they've created. And, there's an argument to be made there, right? About the reality of being driven to a position. Like, here's a good small example, like having groups like USAID, for example, which I hope we can all agree are not what they look like they are. And these are like Trojan horses for regime change, or at least they can be. So groups like China and Russia are wildly justified in saying, get out of here because we know what you're trying to do. And then people scream, cry foul. Oh, you don't care about human rights and so on. But that really is a justified action in my mind to stop something they see as a threat. But when it comes down to these individual rights and arguing that, by creating, let's again, bring it back to COVID-19, to argue that and this is my opinion, to justify that locking people in their homes or any of these things that really did happen were justified because of a perceived threat. I don't care how you justify that. That's the wrong action, because you're taking the choice out of people's hands. And I think that's why we can see, obviously China's authoritarian. I think that has nothing to do with the United States, or at least not in large part. I think it's about a direction this is all going. But we can see these things are being taken away, and now it's being justified in the United States in the same way. So the point comes down to whether or not you trust the government to make the decision about whether this is the next opportunity to pause your rights because said danger has arrived. And I think any government would abuse that situation. So I personally take issue with the idea that this is all about protecting people, because I think by definition, or rather just by peer-reviewed science, you can prove that the actions they took were actually to people's detriments. And I think and I'm not soft pedaling this stuff anymore. That comes down to the injections that are hurting people. That comes down to the obvious science around whether quarantines actually have a positive effect, or whether lockdowns are actually counterproductive, or masks are in fact increasing people's risk of infection. All these are peer-reviewed scientific things I could cite the studies for. The point is, all of these things now are shown, and yet all of them are still doing those same actions. Is that adherence to policy? Knowing that, or these are questions we all need to ask. All said and done, I think that what's happening there, I think the excuse is that it's justified because of them over there, the same way the US government says what we're doing here is justified because of them over there. That doesn't have to be China. The same reason they argue, oh, something happened over here, so we have to push in and do something in that country. And then you later find out 10 years later, they did the thing that justified their action. Like, this is how foreign policy has worked, at least from very least a US foreign policy perspective. So I think where it's going with COVID-19 specifically is a means to an end to justify what's happening with the Great Reset. And it brings us back to the same overarching point that I do believe there's vying agendas in China and the United States, but by and large, it's about creating the top-down control of their population, which all these governments ultimately want. So it's a little bit of a problem. And I think also arguing, in my opinion, that the Chinese people want this. I think that's a really hard thing to sell. Now, I don't know how any of us would really prove that one way or the other. We could all take polls and talk to people, but I find it hard to believe that any human being would want to live in a society where they have no ultimate control over their day-to-day actions. And if they don't say the right things on social media, or, do the right thing or wear the right thing, that they'll suddenly lose their access to said thing. That I don't know any person that would want that unless they're forced into it and forced to make a binary choice, the lesser of two evils, which is how politics works today. Anyway, there's a lot of directions we can go in there, but I think it's obvious that this is leading in that direction, and it's dangerous. And all these other countries are going in that same direction behind it, while demonizing China for doing the same thing. I guess last point, the idea of the multipolar aspect to this is, I think right now that there's obviously more with the whether engineered or not. And I do believe there's a level of this that isn't, the engineered fall of the West is a big discussion to have. But as the United States control over all of this seems to continue to diminish, more people are standing up and speaking their opinions, but all of that's being swept right back in under the idea that what they're preaching is about equitable and sustainable, which, by the way, are good things. That's not what's actually being pushed by the World Economic Forum, though. Those are talking points. So it's like they're using the idea of a multipolar world to, I guess, like lull people into the idea that they're stepping into that, when in reality, it's this trapdoor into the Great Reset. That's how I would ultimately see it. And it's a short, truncated discussion, but there's a lot of points to go into there, but that's how I see it.
Just Ryan, I have a follow-up on that. Where have you seen that people who espouse the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset have been pushing multipolarity? Because I really haven't seen that. I've seen mostly people talking about multipolarity coming from like a more, focused on the United States empire and their tentacles on on the global South, including Latin America, Africa. I haven't really seen those same type of people say, "Oh yes, that's good," cheering for that. I've seen more of like a resistance towards it. Just on that note,
yeah, just to clarify, that's not, I wasn't implying that the World Economic Forum is espousing the idea of multipolar. What I'm saying is that
Okay.
that is over here, the collapse of the West influence, or specifically the U.S. government influence, has created a situation where there's many more opinions being at least spotlighted, discussed. But I think those opinions coming from some of the governments, most of them, while being discussed in that frame, are simply driving people in the direction, whether they know it or not, of what is the Great Reset, which then again we should acknowledge is nothing but globalism. That's what I mean. Not that they're necessarily happening right in the same conversation, but that's just my opinion about where I see it going. I just can't miss how all of them are driving in the same direction. You know, Agenda 2030, for example, under a guise of something that I think everybody should be okay with if that's actually what was happening, which is creating a world that is more sustainable. But I think those are simply talking points hiding the true agenda, which is the overall control of the food source, of anything really that is easier to control people through. That's what I think anyway.
If Danny has to hop out soon, he wanted to respond. Possible.
yeah, Danny, go ahead and respond. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to a few notes about this kind of talk about China and the way it does things. And I think it's important to, I think what happens a lot is that we put on like these kind of blanket statements about China, about Russia, and comparing them to this larger, U.S.-led international financial oligarchic capitalist system. And I think that when it comes to any of these issues like freedom, liberty, there are different definitions to these things. So, in China, I know Canadians living in China. I know Americans living in China. I know Chinese living in China. I've been to China. I've talked to people. And I think there is this incredibly different understanding of what freedom is. So in China, a lot of people would say, well, because of what we've done around COVID-19, we've lived the last 2.5 years a lot more free than people in the United States, for example. People in the United States were still wondering, what should we do about COVID-19 throughout this whole thing, and going through a lot more draconian measures for a lot longer than anything that's happened in China. A lot of China's measures are very short term. It's about spotting outbreaks short term, and then everything opens up. I mean, China was the first place in the world to open up in April of 2020 in Wuhan, which was supposedly, we know now that it wasn't where it initially broke out likely, but it was where it was initially detected and where there was attention on it. And by April 2020, people were living relatively normal lives. And most people in China would say that their lives have been relatively normal for the last couple of years, of course, with attention to outbreaks, of course, with like we see in Shanghai, these kind of short-term lockdowns. But I think in terms of freedom, there's a lot more nuance in terms of what's the relationship between the individual to the collective. And this also, I think, needs to be said that in China, a lot of people have options in social, like, I think we tend to think that freedom is whatever the West and the United States produces for us. But in China, there are social media corporations. There is a huge market for that. There is a lot of, when you go there, you see that there's a huge domestic market. It's a huge one. So there isn't necessarily this urge to consume Facebook and Twitter. We need those things, but a lot of people still do, and there's VPNs and that kind of thing to get around it. And a lot of people would say that that's necessary because of the possible dangers. And I think to underplay or downplay the dangers of the military intelligence apparatus of the United States in undermining sovereignty, in undermining China in particular, kind of erases the history of how China has had to deal with the United States over the course of more than 150 years. But even in just the last 70 years, the United States almost dropped nuclear weapons on China. That wasn't that long ago. That was less than 70 years ago. That was 2022. That was 64 years ago. So it's not like it's that long when China was really actually under threat by the United States, and that these measures came into effect, ironically, after reform and opening up, because China was allowing foreign direct investment in a much larger way so that they could build up the productive forces so that they could become the economy that they are today. So there are trade-offs, and certainly there are a lot of people who criticize the government who say this, I'd rather have this, I'd rather have that. But overall, collectively, there is an understanding that this is part of the risk, that this is a problem. And we can't downplay that, because I think that possibly leads us into a situation where we downplay the US's aggression towards China, which has happened all across the United States and the West. It has happened. We don't have that sense of urgency. And I think there are a lot more people even talking about Ukraine and what the US has done there with NATO to instigate with Russia than we have around China. And I think that's a mistake, because I think they're both equally dangerous in what the US is doing, and possibly the stakes and the potential threat for war is actually maybe, I think, is higher with Taiwan and with what the US is doing with China, because of how just absolutely megalomaniac these neocons are around the direction that China in particular is going in.
All right. Thank you, Danny. I just have a couple last questions, guys, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you, Danny. If you do have to go, I appreciate you coming on and having this discussion. So, guys, there's a strong criticism against China, too, perhaps going a little bit over the top in certain sectors of Africa. There's this fear of exploitation. Now, you mostly only hear good things about China in the Belt and Road Initiative. For example, Bolivia is a country that has largely profited from the China's relationship via infrastructure, via transportation, and we see that happening throughout the global South in what most describe as an equitable relationship. On the other hand, China does continue to have a relationship with Israel, as does Russia. China does continue to arm Saudi Arabia, and Russia also has a relationship with Saudi Arabia via gas. So there's this tendency from the left and from anti-imperialists to say, well, this is worthy of criticism of both China and Russia. Let's remove the United States from the equation. If we were to remove tomorrow the United States, many argue, and this is largely what I think some people who are very much anti-China argue, if we remove the United States, China will become the next empire. They will become exploiters. What are the yeses and nos to that argument? And whoever wants to jump in first.
I could, or no, Brian, you want to go for it, or?
Oh, either way, yeah. I was going to say ultimately that I think that what we're seeing is, again, to speak to my pessimism about governments in general, I think that left to that situation, any government would take charge of the same idea of try to fill that role of being the, freedom spreading good guy, when in reality they're taking actions that are to their benefit. And that will morph and evolve over time to collect power at the top and eventually be in the same situation. I see that. I mean, history has proven that. But what I think is interesting is right now to take a focus on like Africa, for example. I take big issue with the framing of like the United States being the sole good guy actor. It's completely disconnected from reality. And I think what's happening is we can see, like, take Africa, for example, and how the US government, or even, South America, is going in these areas under a justification of stopping bad guys or protecting things and just doing what they want with nobody's approval, especially not the government they're doing it with or the people of that country. We've seen that all over especially South America. But then they point over and say, we can't just let China take over Africa. And you're going, wait, are they taking over Africa, or are they making deals with people that it's, whether or not they're strong arming, which I guarantee is happening to some degree, in any deal, you're going to exert your power over the situation that benefits you the most. That's just dealing. But the point is, at the end of the day, they're signing agreements with China, right? In a lot of these different ways. And so ultimately, is that worse? it is from an imperialistic standpoint of the US government, right? They don't want China to have that control, or they don't want Russia to have that control. But at the end of the day, is that the justification for them to then push in that country and protect those assets like they're doing in Syria or anywhere else where they're not really protecting them? They're capitalizing it for themselves. So it's a game that's being played. And I made this argument before about Russia. There was an interview I had earlier today about any government like Russia is a good example, I argue, playing the good guy. And acting that out because it's wildly politically advantageous for them right now to counteract what the U.S. do with their clumsy actions around the world. Let's take Ukraine, for example, and stepping in and playing a role that's perceived as the good guy. Now, do I know that's not because he wants to be the good guy or because he wants to do right, Putin specifically or the Russian government? No, but I do think that it's obviously politically advantageous for them to play that role. So I think there's a factor in that, but ultimately, I think to your point, if the U.S. government was just removed, I think, yes, that whether Russia or China or somebody else would fill that role. And I think that's the problem with having any kind of centralized power. And that goes right back to the idea of what happened with COVID and whether you can just rationalize it. And maybe in that moment, they did mean what they said about maybe, it's safer here or to Danny's point. And it's a good point about stopping social media. I mean, who's going to argue that Facebook and Twitter aren't terrible things destroying our society? We need to see that those things are bad and that they are being used by the military industrial complex. But, it's just a hard conversation to have because controlling people's choices, I don't agree with at a core value. Right. So I think it's a problematic situation and removing them would just ultimately create another problem.
Matt, I just want to hear your, on that.
Yeah, sure. I think as far as looking at history, I think it is useful, obviously, and it does always give us context and an insight into the nature of what we're talking about. Looking at China's history, I think is useful as a first step in answering the question. Since going back to the days of the Han Dynasty and the First Silk Road, originally that lasted for 400 years, or its renewal under the Tang Dynasty, which ended up falling apart in the 10th century, or again looking at the Qing or other period. I mean, the last 2,000 years of Chinese history has shown no examples of the type of exploitative imperialism that we have seen coming out of the IMF, World Bank, and previously the Belgian, French, British imperial outlook. It's just a different thing. They've always done respectful commerce with countries that were along the Silk Road within Africa. We've seen, the trading of goods, of knowledge. We haven't really seen the type of activity that we have done in the West so destructively to so many people in the world. Not to say that is what the West is, because I don't believe that. I think that there's, like I point out, there's good and bad currents within the West. There's times where we get better and times where we decay, get corrupted, and get worse. And then the question is, do we fall into a dark age as a consequence of our own embrace of folly and decay, or do we go follow Machiavelli's advice in the Discourses in Livy and return to foundational principles or not? And that was, I think, one of the questions in the Civil War as well. Is the nation, does it have the mandate of heaven or not? Can you heal from your own self-mutilation and immorality? That China's had to deal with that too, with what they did as far as their self-mutilation during the Cultural Revolution, which was really self-mutilation. And then the one-child policy, which again came in, that wasn't even a China policy. That was brought in by Henry Kissinger and the Club of Rome. I've written a whole chapter on that. That was brought in. The Club of Rome is not a China organization, but they brought in their models as one of the conditions upon which China was going to be the producer slave society of cheap labor sweatshops on the outskirts of the coastal region, for the consumer cult that was supposed to be created in the early 70s as the beginning of a new type of era of post-industrialism and worshiping of consumer goods instead of capital production, which used to define the better component of what the U.S. had represented, as well as Canada and the Europe as well before that period. It took a lot of assassinations to get that coup d'etat. But the idea was, it was this H.G. Wellsian type of, we're going to create a society where we're going to have the haves, the have-nots, and then we're going to have the third world who really have nothing, the dark continent, which will just stay. They won't even have cheap labor. We're just going to use them to fight each other, stay, starving. Even today, you got 15,000 children who died today of starvation, mostly in Africa, and preventable diseases. And got, I think, 50,000 kids in Congo working in cobalt mines and lithium. So that's, that was an intention where we're just going to use that entire continent for resource extraction with no development, no full spectrum economic development, no knowledge building, no education for the engineering cadres of the future. None of that. That would only be for Barrick Gold, for De Beers, for whoever is going to be the beneficiaries of the IMF, conditionality laced loans. So when I look at China, I mean, when they're going in there, and I'm talking here about China, Africa, you've got I've written a lot about this, but you can look at this array of projects that are all cohesive, and they're training tens, if not hundreds of thousands of engineers across all of these different countries and providing scholarships to study at the best universities in China for free, and then sent back to then train the next generation in Sudan and Ethiopia and Nigeria. And I mean, it's a big list. Russia's doing similar things too. Part of it too, I don't think it's really just, I don't think it's just they're playing the good guys, but I don't think that they're being altruistic angels either. I think it's just common sense business, like real, if you're going to do business in a way which is actually to your benefit, you don't want to destroy the world that you live in, and you don't want to make the world hate you and want to kill you, ideally, so in that sense, the type of agreements, when I look at the loans, that there's very similar quantities numerically of loans to Africa by China as we've had from the United States. I think it's up to $200 billion or so in trade. And so, but look at the breakdown qualitatively. If you look at these pie charts of like, where is the money going from China versus the USA? China's actually building a big chunk of their investments. Big chunk is towards building manufacturing, building schools, hospitals, building national banking systems, situations where these countries in Africa for the first time have access to their own financial mechanisms, which has never been permitted by Western loans that only want mining and good governance, basically getting their little zombie-like cultists into positions of managerial authority within these various governing, structures that they want to rape. So it's it shows a very different intention underlying those statistics. And I would say the same thing when I look at Russia, even though it's a smaller number, it's only $20 billion in trade. Look at the energy policies that, Rosatom has met with every single African leader, who's 40 countries have joined the BRI. And they've actually offered helping these countries leapfrog into the 21st century with nuclear power, with all of the dirty energy sources you're not allowed to use under the green governance agenda of decarbonization. Russia, China are saying, well, no, you need to develop. You got to do what the West did this in 300 years. You have to do this a lot sooner, and you have all of these resources under your land. Why are we going to ban you from using them? Because they're like so-called, our computer models say they're bad for the environment. So they're not doing any of that. And I feel like I've rambled too much. I'm sorry, but that's how I'm looking at it.
No, this was a great discussion. Does anybody have a response to that?
I'm just here. I just want to add one more thing. I think people covered it well, just for 30 seconds, just to say that when it comes to China and Chinese history, I don't think, and maybe I could be wrong, maybe I'll live to see a world where the United States is just off the map and we'll see things degrade. But I don't think there's any popular appetite for emulating Western style democracy. And I've met a few of them, but there's very little, and even they know inside of China that their heads would be rolling if they repeated the disaster of trying to copy it, which happened after the 1911 first democratic revolution, where there was a lot of poverty, a lot of betrayal, a lot of just a lot of things that just went absolutely horrifically wrong, which led to the Chinese Revolution, 1949. So I don't think there's any appetite for that. And I think it's hard when we're talking about taking the U.S. off the map, because you mentioned Israel and Saudi Arabia. If you take the U.S. out of the equation, the economies and societies of Saudi Arabia and Israel look a lot different, right? I mean, I'm of the opinion if the United States were to fall tomorrow, that also these countries would not have the same kind of constitution in terms of their government and how things are done. So I guess it would look different, but I think I'm in agreement with what Matt was saying about how China does things abroad. I don't think it would look the same at all to how the United States does things, because already we see how in such a very tough environment, it could be easy to emulate the United States. Sure, the United States would love it, because that would mean that they could weaken China in a lot of ways. China can't compete in that way. So in a sense, yeah, I think that's all I have to say on that. But thank you for the conversation.
I'd like to add one
Yeah.
thing too, just to speak on the point about the idea of how it's different. And this is kind of the point I was alluding to in the same way, is that whether that's, again, kind of like Matt was saying, whether that's in their best interest or they want to, they do it because it's a moral thing to go and not just take something, but actually work with the local population and develop an agreement, or it's just because they want to play it, however you look at it, that is what's happening. Right. And that's an important differentiation between just screaming whatever you want to justify what you're doing and just taking things by force, but the last thing I was going to say to Danny's point is that ultimately I think it's a mistake to argue that any discussion of freedom is taken from the model of the United States, right? Because there's a definition to the word, right? And it's nothing to do with what the US government is framing it as. That's a very important thing to understand, because I hope people have gleaned from our conversation that I don't want any of these governments. I think the US government's authoritarian, and so too are Russian and China, but they have their obvious differences. I see them all leading in a kind of the same direction. But at the end of the day, all of it comes down to choice. Every person should have a choice. And if you argue that the Chinese people want QR codes and vaccine passports and control over their social credit, whether they can live their life a certain way, I don't know how that's possible, but if they do, and you could prove that, then absolutely let them do that. But I just don't think that's true. That's my opinion. But at the end of the day, it comes down to choice. And I think all these things lead in a direction where you're taking that choice away under one justification or another. And I think that's a dangerous thing.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for the discussion. I appreciate it. The different perspectives, obviously, they're all clearly different. But I think we can all agree that the West is, in one way or another, losing its hold on what it once was as this very dictatorial boss around the world. And what we're seeing is going to have consequences on the rest of the world, whatever that becomes. So I appreciate all of you coming on here. And if you have anything else to say, please go ahead. And go ahead and plug in your socials as well, where people can find you and your work.
Sure. You want to go? Okay, I'll go. Yeah, sure. So yeah, thank you for doing this. I think it's a good discussion that should continue to unfold. I mean, the world is giving us a lot to talk about, and so yeah, I think this is an important conversation. And I mean, you brought up the question of freedom. That's almost a whole topic unto itself, because I don't think it's as clear cut as a consensus on the idea or the definition of freedom. I mean, I think that. I think that there's a bigger debate about like the idea of freedom to not starve, freedom to have a world that's not going to, kill you or enslave you, all of these things. So maybe the next time we meet up, we could talk about something like that as a starting point. If people want to get my work, they can go to canadianpatriot.org. The Untold History of Canada book series that goes through sort of the roundtable movement of the roundtable deep state that has always shaped Canada, that unpacks that story, and the Clash of the Two Americas trilogy. That's all easily available. Also, my Substack is my bread and butter. So if people want to get the free or the upgraded paid, that helps. That's matthewehret.substack.com. Lastly, risingtidefoundation.net is more of a cultural educational platform I started with my wife a couple of years ago. And I think, yeah, that's a lot to work with there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thanks for having us on. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I think it's important to flesh this out. And obviously, I think to Matt's point, that it still isn't, right? I mean, there's a lot of conversation to be had and a lot of opinion, which is always how this goes. Nobody knows for sure what the intentions are of the Russian government or the Chinese government. And I think it's just clear that we, to your actual point there about freedom. Yeah, I agree. And we're on the exact same page there. I referenced the definition only as a central point to say that there's general consensus on like the general idea. But at the end of the day, that's why I made it about choice. It comes down to choice. That's my opinion. It's about giving people the choice, because that choice then is their own freedom to make that choice for themselves about whatever we're talking about. But yeah, I think it's a really great conversation, and I'm glad that we had it today. And I think that where this is going is rapidly alarming, and increasingly so with every choice that's being made. And there's a place for conversation about this right now, but I feel like more action is needed today. So that's all I want people to think about, is that we need to start standing up and even if that action is verbalizing your opinion in a time where it's been shown that that's dangerous to do, right? Stand up and tell people how you think, because I think a lot more of you out there think similar things than you realize. And I think they want you to stay in that box. But check out thelastamericanvagabond.com. That's my website. Everything else stems from there. Don't let them out there be the conduit between you and our information. Don't go to YouTube or Twitter. Go to the website. Go to Matt's Substack, right? Go directly to the source. Thank you for having us on. It was a great conversation.
Yes, awesome. Thank you both. And since Danny had to go, Danny Haiphong is on Black Agenda Report, and you can find him on his Twitter, and also he has his own YouTube channel. So I want to thank all three of my guests.
Danny Haiphong.
I'm sorry?
He's on Patreon too. I think it's just
Patreon.
/Danny Haiphong.
Yes. Okay, guys, thanks so much for tuning in and for watching us. And yes, we'll see you next time. We'll see you Friday on the Combo Couch. Combo out.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye.